Welcome to episode 29 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hello.
Hey, Andrew. As we tackle a different featured topic each episode. New episodes are out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. Ratings and reviews are appreciated, and you can drop us a line anytime at podcast@firewalls.com. As always, thanks for listening, and now it's time to introduce our featured topic and our guests for this episode.
Every organization faces challenges staying protected in the constantly changing cyber threat landscape, but state and local government agencies can have it particularly hard. These agencies may be responsible for critical infrastructure, education, and much more, so any breach can have catastrophic consequences, not just for the agency itself, but for the citizens who rely on its services.
Yet these agencies can face added hurdles above and beyond the private sector in maintaining a cybersecure posture, and they often find themselves squarely in the crosshairs of online attackers. To discuss those challenges and what to do about them, we welcome Jim Richberg, Field Chief Information Security Officer with Fortinet, and the author of a recent article focused on the issue. Jim, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Glad to be with you guys.
Appreciate it. And before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about what your position entails as a field CISO at Fortinet?
Well, cybersecurity is complicated both as a subject and as it relates to the customers. So Fortinet established positions called field CISOs to work with various large vertical industries. I spent 34 years in the federal government, all of it in the intelligence community, and that made me a ripe candidate to be our field CISO, our interlocutor for dealing with government customers. So I deal with a range of federal, state, local, and some of our larger foreign partners as well. So I have a good appreciation for the requirements, the constraints, the missions of government. I now have a good understanding of what private sector capabilities can be. So it was a natural fit to take someone like me and put me in as the field CISO responsible for working largely, but not exclusively, with the public sector. I also work with a range of large enterprise customers as well.
I think when a lot of people think of sort of the government work involved in cybersecurity, their mind automatically goes to the larger federal agencies. But you recently wrote an article that focuses more on the state and local, down to the municipalities even. So what makes these types of entities unique compared to the larger federal enterprise?
So it is a combination of capabilities and mission. By and large, these organizations don't have the either depth of financial resources or depth of human resources that their larger federal counterparts do. I came at this issue from the work I've been doing on election security, where at the federal level, intermittently for the past 15 years, I was responsible for helping to secure U.S. elections against malign foreign interference. And in my work since retirement from the federal government with state and local election officials, I've come to recognize that 1/3 of the 8,000 to 10,000 places in this country that do voting don't even have local IT staff in government. Now, I can't think of any federal agency, no matter how small, that doesn't have IT professionals and certainly cybersecurity professionals as well. And yet we're dealing with that kind of shortage in terms of the people and then the money that you can put against solving cybersecurity problems.
So you mentioned in your article just how many key services that states and local agencies are responsible for, not just elections, but things like public utilities, education, and more. Plus, they hold quite a bit of data about the citizens that they serve. So is cybersecurity, as it stands today, evolving in a way that will help these agencies protect a wider array of possible attack vectors?
I've spent a lot of my career in government as a strategic thinker. And again, I came from the U.S. intelligence community, so I was at various points in my career working on the offensive side of lawful foreign intelligence collection. So I've played offense as well as defense. And I think something that's not widely appreciated is that we are on the cusp of a revolution in cybersecurity. The big OEMs like Fortinet have been coming up with these broad ecosystems of capability. We talk often about cybersecurity being hard because we say, and I hate this phrase, the attack surface is growing. I don't like to call it an attack surface because I want to avoid an attack. The effective interconnectedness of the digital revolution is something that is our reality. You don't need to avoid it. You need to manage the risk it brings. So I prefer to call it a vulnerability surface. But what if you instrument the breadth of that surface? And the instrumentation are sensors. You generate a ton of data. You generate more data than any number of humans could get through. But if you can apply AI and machine learning, you can, over time, develop the capability of characterizing what's happening on these different networks in real time. You can know what's normal and what's abnormal. You can know what's abnormal and simply bears watching from what's abnormal and probably or certainly malicious. And you can stop it where it's happening, and you can stop it everywhere else. That's a game changer, because this combination of the platform approach to cybersecurity and AI and machine learning really takes the advantage away from the attackers who've never been perfect. They've never been invisible. They've just relied on the fact that we're not looking for them everywhere in real time. Take those advantages away, you put it back on the enterprise side. And then to be able to say, and I can unify both my network operations and that security in a single pane of glass, that's very powerful, even for small jurisdictions.
So in a government scenario, in some of these smaller state, local governments, there is still potentially some difficulty in getting to knowing now that there are solutions out there that are usable for them, that can protect them pretty well, to getting to the point of adopting those solutions. How do you recommend that these entities kind of handle the challenges of getting from knowing it's there to being able to implement it?
Well, the first challenge is I think a lot of them don't even know it's there. And I even see this happen with larger organizations as well. We're very tactical and transactional in cybersecurity. I'm looking to upgrade my firewall or my endpoint protection or my access point, and you look at the merits of that particular decision. When I was a big federal program manager, I called the 2 Ps. You look at performance and you look at price. And I have been telling government, especially state and local government, add a third P to that paradigm, add platform, know what the affiliation of the various contenders you're evaluating is. If you're looking for something that is not in one of these platform ecosystems, all things being equal, that should be a red flag, because these are very broad ecosystems. In the case of Fortinet, we have over 300 vendor partners in there. So it's not as if it all has to be branded from one organization. But if you don't pick an ecosystem to consolidate on, you're losing the opportunity to get this kind of synergy. And if you do go with a platform approach, you can do incremental upgrade. Just depending on what part of your ecosystem and infrastructure you're upgrading, you just piecemeal your way in. But it would be a bad outcome to do 3 successive security upgrades and find out only after the fact that there's such a thing as platforms, and you bought one piece from 3 different platforms.
Yeah, we've certainly heard customers of our own with similar woes where they've sort of Frankenstein together bits and pieces of multiple platforms and aren't finding that synergy there that you mentioned.
And it gets ugly. And I have been making this argument since I joined the private sector 18 months ago. And you may be familiar with NSS Labs, which is basically the closest thing we seem to have in cybersecurity to a Consumer Reports. They did a test in August of last year of breach prevention systems. They were systems or suites, and they did this because their customers said, look, these big vendors are telling us they have these things called platform families, and that they're the greatest things since sliced bread, that they're better than best-of-breed solutions. So NSS took a number of the leading candidates. They took best-of-breed firewalls. They took endpoint protection. They tested them against live threat data and some engineered samples that were essentially 0 days that were hiding. And they ran it against the firewall. They ran it against the endpoint protection. And then they ran it against the ability to use the artificial intelligence and ML and glue them together. And as a class, for virtually all of the vendors tested, the integrated approach beat best-of-breed point products. So there's empirical proof that any family is better than best-of-breed solutions. Now, we can argue over the maturity and the openness of the different ecosystems, but that's the point I'm trying to make to local government is don't just listen to me as someone who's with the vendor. Go look at the third-party testing. This is not a matter of does this work, should we do it? Make informed decisions now. And it'll pay off in terms of automation and ease of use as you successively upgrade the parts of your infrastructure.
Right. So one thing on the rise the last couple of years everybody can't really ignore any longer is ransomware, and specifically ransomware that's beginning to target a lot of these local and state governments. As covered earlier, they've got quite a lot of critical infrastructure and even citizen data under their watch. And so these are becoming riper and riper targets. How has that shift in threat in the threat landscape sort of translated to different types of efforts on the private sector's part to keep the data secure?
So I think part of it has come down to you want to do what you can on cybersecurity. You want to do what you can on user training because, again, spear phishing is a primary way that organizations get compromised. But at the end of the day, you need to be doing very, very timely backup and have backups that in some cases are off-premise and not connected to the net as well. We hit an unfortunate watershed this last week. I don't know if you saw the news coming out of Germany. The first fatality in a medical facility that was attributed to ransomware. There was the hospital that had ransomware, and in the time that they took to transfer a patient facing surgery somewhere else, they died en route. So now we have talked about the potential of ransomware to get into critical services and go beyond targeting your financial well-being, actually start affecting health and safety. We've now seen it. But you certainly want to do what you can on cybersecurity. But then at the end of the day, I think backups become really important too. And frankly, there's the very lively debate about the value of cyber insurance. I've talked to a number of state and local governments that say they recognize the value of having cyber insurance, but they also fear that it may make them a more attractive target. Because if you have insurance and what the level of payout are is typically a matter of public record, and they think that criminals may be preferentially targeting organizations who they know have insurance that will back them up and that will promptly pay.
Yeah, there are a lot of layers to the ransom situation with insurance. Also, I know some of the ransomware operators lately are actually doing some digging into the finances of their targets to sort of decide what ransom demand they'll have for that particular target as well.
And one of the nastier spins we started seeing on ransomware, really with the rise of COVID, was what looked like a combination of ransomware and the threat of doxing, where they would exfiltrate some of the data as well as encrypt it. And to give you an additional inducement to pay rather than restore from backup, they would say, and we will publish these records if you don't pay up as well. So, they're creative. You got to give the malicious actors that.
So getting back to the article in particular, we've talked about a couple of these, the top 5 list of challenges that you listed. The fact that we have sensitive and valuable data and some of the personnel constraints. A couple others that you've listed, budgetary constraints, footprint expansion, and compliance were the others in the top 5. So first off, what kind of an issue are you seeing with budgetary constraints and perhaps hesitancy to spend on cybersecurity?
State and local government are facing what I've been calling the perfect storm. They have got, their resources are in free fall. I have been talking to state and local government nationwide, and I typically do a straw poll and ask them about their budgets. And 1 in 10 have actually gotten more money. But for the rest of them, they've either already taken significant budget cuts, or I said, okay, for the remainder of you, I can tell you you're on a calendar year budgeting cycle. You're going to catch it next year. We are in a fiscal black hole. It is forecast that we may be facing a $1 trillion shortage in state and local resources next year. And at the same time, demand for digital services has exploded. We've seen things like unemployment insurance, the applications were going up 3,000% in the early part of COVID. Other parts of government have had to curtail their physical services and have been looking to make up that shortfall with an expansion of digital services. So this is that classic bind of you are being asked to do more with less resources. The footprint of vulnerability expanded with the pivot to remote telework for government. That introduced extra complexity and an additional attack and vulnerability surface there. So this is a really hard situation. I saw this innumerable times in my career at the federal level. When the budget gets cut, you tend to preserve core mission elements. And for better or worse, things like cybersecurity and even, or IT and even more so cybersecurity get called support functions. And so you will take budget cuts in those areas. And it's doubly hard for security because if you cut the security budget or don't fund a new initiative, the risk is not visible until the breach happens. So it looks like a convenient, easy place to absorb risk until the problem starts, and then you point fingers and say you should have fixed it. So as the money gets tight, I think local government and state government are under increasing pressure to spend smarter, because they're not going to be able to spend more or even as much to deliver more services and still try to find creative ways to deliver cybersecurity in that mix of products and services. It's a real challenge.
So moving on to the actual solutions that you've mentioned in your article and sort of what state and local governments should be looking to implement in order to tighten up their security and potentially even save some money while doing so. Number one on the list, secure access, which obviously is quite a large thing in 2020 all of a sudden. So what advice do you have for these entities when they begin to set up secure access and have, workers all over a geographic area that may not be able to come into the office or might not work in, that same location whatsoever?
The obvious thing is you need things like multi-factor authentication, and you need the ability to ensure the security of the device at the far end, at the remote user's end. One of the scary parts of that is we like to think we had perfect or near perfect control of the operating environment in the enterprise. Frankly, we were deceiving ourselves. It was never perfect. But the reality is at the far end, we really, in many cases, don't even know what's present on that network. We certainly saw the malicious actors pivot to start targeting small office, home office infrastructure, which tends to be more weakly secured than its corporate or government counterparts. You don't know who else in that environment is got a VPN to dodgy places. You've got the potential for IoT. You've got all sorts of things that may be happening there that could potentially introduce risk back into the corporate and government network or into the government cloud. So I think this puts a premium on being able to inspect the traffic that's coming back. And if you don't, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, don't trust and verify. You really want to be able to do full packet inspection on what you're hauling back, because you don't know, even if it's a government issued device, that something didn't compromise it in the local environment. So my first part of secure access is to say, do your best to know the far end environment, or to, if it's a government device, be able to preclude it from touching the other things in that environment. But you definitely want to look at what's coming back as well. And this is when I say you need to have a dialogue between security and network operations, because the security guys might look at the specifications and say, oh, we have a firewall that's capable of doing SSL inspection. We're good. Talk to the network people, because they may say, because of the surge in demand and the inadequate bandwidth, and to keep from getting unacceptable latency, we turned off SSL inspection because it often introduces so much latency that for many devices, for many devices from many vendors, it just slows things down too much. So this is a matter of, even within the organization, now you need to verify what you think you've implemented as a security solution on access.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about that, a lot of the other pieces of the solution puzzle here, with the integrated security, AI being involved, advanced threat detection. And it kind of ties into, I think, the conclusion that you had in the piece, which is focusing on the need for that sustainable cybersecurity. So how do those all tie in for a state and local government?
So I think this is where, especially post-COVID, state and local government need to find the technology solutions that are going to give them more bang for the increasingly scarce buck. And I think that points them in the direction of things like secure and consistent multi-cloud operations. I think most users have basically figured out how to use the cloud, and increasingly they understand the shared security responsibility model for cloud security. But the problem seems to come when a typical organization may be in 3, 4, or 5 separate cloud providers, and you can end up with incompatible and different security levels and policies across those clouds. So saying we want to harmonize those is important. Software-defined networking, I think, is key, because as organizations need to stretch their dollars, as they're busy recapitalizing branch offices or the ability to provide remote services, it's a great opportunity to say, we don't need all these leased T1 lines. We don't need to maintain actual wired network infrastructure at these branch locations. It can be done on software-defined basis, software-defined wide area networking. And if you say, yes, I'm going to do that, because the private sector has seen an explosion in SD-WAN as a technology over the last 5 years. It's cheaper, it's more flexible, the organization can change the prioritization of applications as it needs to, gets better user experience. But there are really 3 different ways to do it. One is just about the traffic management. Security is not part of the equation. Well, if you don't use a firewall and you no longer have a defined perimeter, we know the kind of bad things that can happen. So the second solution was hybrid, where you either had some kind of security concentrator in this virtual network, or you went into a secure enclave before you hit the internet. Or the third solution is to say it's an integral device, physical or virtual. It does firewall, it does software-defined networking, and that way you get to have your cake and eat it too. So finding ways like that you can say government can do things that will enhance its productivity, and by having security and IT frame the art of the possible before they take it to the rest of the organization, you can end up with solutions that give you the productivity and the security that, frankly, I think we need to deliver in this COVID and post-COVID environment.
Yeah, thanks very much for joining us today. Really interesting stuff.
My pleasure.
It's time again for Ransomware Reckoning, in which our Firewalls.com colleague Andrew Nita shines a spotlight on a high-profile ransomware case, because unfortunately there are plenty to choose from each week.
Blackbaud, one of the nation's largest cloud service database providers in the non-for-profit space, was hit with a supply chain attack that successfully penetrated the network. Blackbaud reported that in May 2020, they identified an attempted ransomware attack and framed the response as a successful prevention. But all isn't what it seems on the surface. Multiple credible reports have stated that Blackbaud agreed to pay the hackers an unidentified ransom amount to secure their stolen data. Although the hacking group claimed they destroyed the remains of what they stole, there is no way to officially verify if what they said is true. The timeline of the disclosure of the ransomware announcement is also being scrutinized. According to the GDPR, organizations have 72 hours to disclose a breach. It took Blackbaud nearly 2 months to report. At the moment, it's still unknown if they will face repercussions for their handling of the attack. Stay tuned to the Ping podcast for updates on ransomware attacks all across the globe.
Now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we take a closer look at a few top stories in the cybersecurity world and what they may mean to you. Headline number 1. Patient dies after ransomware attack reroutes her to remote hospital. So this is a scary one, and one that came up in our interview a bit with Jim as well. Something we've also discussed in a more abstract sense before when we've spotlighted other hospitals that have faced ransomware attacks. So in the story out of Germany, a woman seeking emergency treatment for a life-threatening condition died after a ransomware attack reportedly crippled a nearby hospital in Dusseldorf and forced her to obtain services from a facility further away, causing about an hour delay in her treatment.
Right, and this is a very sad story that kind of goes to show what real-world impact that these types of attacks can have on people outside of, just the whole, it's a business expense of staying safe, and there's actual real implications out into the world that can sort of unfold. So this story took place originally at Dusseldorf University Hospital. As you said, they turned her way as they could not operate normally due to the attack, which had apparently occurred just the day before.
Yeah, so a report from the North Rhine-Westphalia State Justice Minister said the attack encrypted about 30 hospital servers and left a message instructing the Heinrich Heine University, to which the hospital is affiliated, to contact the attackers.
Yeah, it seems like perhaps they were targeting the university itself, and really the Dusseldorf University Hospital being affiliated with them just kind of got caught in the crossfire.
That's a possible explanation there, though there's still some gaps in the information that we have. But we do know that hospital officials tweeted that the infection occurred after attackers exploited a vulnerability in a widely used commercial add-on software. So they didn't say which software, but they did notify German authorities. And the article that we're working off of does have a possible culprit for the software.
Right. So apparently back in January, an advisory had been sent alerting German agencies to a exploit with the Citrix application delivery controller. If you're interested in looking it up, that's CVE 2019 19781. So that is the suspected service, but again, not a lot of concrete answers were offered here. We don't know what kind of ransomware it was. We're not sure what kind of ransom was asked for or anything like that, but it seems that the attackers did unencrypt all those files for the hospital after law enforcement informed them that they had in fact locked up a hospital instead of their intended target.
I know the authorities were potentially considering actually bringing manslaughter charges against the perpetrators of this ransomware attack, because you do have a connect the dots situation, a negligent manslaughter situation, because if this person had been able to get to the hospital and get treated at the hospital that she originally intended to, she may still be alive today.
Right, and this is a hypothetical that we've discussed on the show before. We've talked about the Alabama hospital district getting hacked and with ransomware and sort of getting locked up for a few days. I believe that was, 6 or 7 different hospitals?
And we talked at the time on that episode about, what those implications could be, but we never saw any story saying that a particular person was affected in this manner. But this one's actually connecting it directly to the ransomware attack.
Right, and when we've had past guests on to talk about ransomware cells, like Hildecrypt, for example, one thing they do mention is that many have a sort of rule where you do not target this type of infrastructure like a hospital, but seems this group accidentally did so anyways.
And, some of the cells also have rules not to go after any educational facilities. So one way or another, this particular ransomware cell, not so concerned with some of those rules, and maybe should have thought about the fact that universities do often have hospitals associated with them.
Right.
But it's definitely an unfortunate story, but it makes perfect sense that something like this could happen if a hospital falls victim to a ransomware attack. They need patient records. You don't know what else they may not have access to due to encryption, whether it's inventory of particular medicines for treatment, whether they have machines that they might need available. Maybe there's even something that messes with some of the machines if there's some sort of management system in place that's on the network. So there are a lot of potential avenues for treatment that get cut off with an attack on a hospital, and so now we see some real life consequences. On to headline number 2. Dunkin Donuts settles data breach lawsuit. In more news of cover-ups have consequences, which we talked about a couple of those in our previous episode, the state of New York has settled a lawsuit with Dunkin Donuts for $650,000 in penalties, and also making them follow specific requirements relating to cybersecurity and some follow-ups from this particular breach.
Right, and we talk about often how the consequences of a breach can be much more costly than just a simple matter of what was stolen. There's also reputational damage. Now you're seeing also the legal side of these consequences, where you have lawsuits and more strict regulations to follow. So this all stemmed from a data breach that began in 2015. This was basically a credential stuffing attacks, tens of thousands of customer accounts being basically brute forced by hackers trying to access their information on their Dunkin cards.
Right, and the Dunkin cards are sort of like a gift card, rewards card, something to that effect. they could be used to actually make purchases at Dunkin' stores.
Yeah, so once they gain access to the accounts, they will be able to use the DDE accounts, the Dunkin' Donuts card, to make purchases or to remove the card from the account and then sell it online. So not sure how many people are cruising the dark web for donut cash, but apparently someone had that available for sale.
Yeah, it's a non-zero number because they do say in the story that tens of thousands of dollars were affected in this particular situation. So according to the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, Dunkin' was repeatedly alerted to attackers' ongoing attempts to log into customer accounts by the third-party app developer that they were using, and the app developer even provided Dunkin' with a list of nearly 20,000 accounts that had been compromised by attackers over just a sample 5-day period, but Dunkin' not so interested in acknowledging that.
They basically did not conduct any investigations into these warnings that they were given, and as such, 20,000 customers had been impacted and were not informed in any way. So not only did they fail to notify customers about this, but they did not reset their passwords if they found that they were breached, or they didn't even freeze the cards if they knew about them. So they just said, this card's compromised, but it's still being used, so let's let it roll.
This basically suggests that Dunkin' got this reported to them and they went off into the corner and went, la, 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 everything's fine, la, 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 la.
Keep buying donuts.
Yeah, because it doesn't even look like they acted in their own interest here to close up any holes. Even if they were not that concerned with customer data, you'd think that if these cards and the money and all of those things were changing hands, that it would not be good for Dunkin' on its own. So they just didn't want to acknowledge that any kind of cybersecurity issue was happening.
So what are the other requirements in the settlement then? In addition to this $650,000 in penalties being paid to the state of New York, Dunkin' must also notify customers about the attacks, reset all their passwords, and then provide refunds for anyone who did have their sweet, sweet donut money stolen.
They also will have to be required in the future to maintain safeguards against similar attacks and follow specific incident response procedures when an attack occurs. Basically, they're being forced to do what they probably should have done themselves right off the bat. We're talking about a data breach that began in early 2015, and when we say began, literally, this was sort of allowed to keep going on for a couple or few years before any consequences came about afterwards. So they really were just, according to this, basically trying to pretend that nothing was happening. And there was a consequence to doing that in addition to, the reputational damage afterwards. And the person interviewed in this article that we're working off of from Security Magazine, Fausto Oliveira, a principal security architect at Accepto, says actually that when a company doesn't take action when they're first notified, word can spread among the cybercrime community, and then others will go, well, if they're not going to do anything, then I guess we can get in on this.
Let's join this gravy train.
Bavarian cream train? I don't know.
So I guess what you would say is that Dunkin' was betting dollars to donuts that this would never be called out by anyone. And they've lost that bet.
They have lost that bet. I don't know if maybe they took the donuts off of the store name afterwards. And that it was a different company that had this data breach happen.
Right.
Yeah, one simple solution here that Oliveira mentions too, as you said, these attacks were credential stuffing attacks, which are pretty simple attacks compared to
fairly primitive.
Yeah, online. If they had simply done a little bit more with their username password situation, a multi-factor authentication scenario could have prevented the attack from the get-go. Again, making some simple adjustments, there really just does not seem to be an argument for why Dunkin' didn't do something, even if they didn't want to make it a big public thing. It seems like they could have done some simple things after hearing about the breach to prevent it from continuing.
Right, at least cut off the cards.
Yeah, it's all bad, and they are paying for it now, both in actual dollars from this lawsuit, from having to pay back the cards, and, of course, to reputational damage. And Krispy Kreme is probably enjoying themselves right now.
Yeah, I was probably never going to get a Dunkin' card, but now I have another reason not to.
Now, headline number 3. Trump approves TikTok deal, but big questions remain. So we've talked TikTok before on this podcast, and as of just a few days before we record the podcast, it looked like TikTok's time was just about up as far as U.S. usage goes. But the latest, there is a tentative deal that was reached that would see Oracle and Walmart take minority stakes in a new U.S. company that will operate TikTok, with the idea that it would take operation of the app out of the hands of the Chinese company ByteDance and make some changes with the national security concerns that come with having a Chinese-owned company potentially tied to the Chinese government.
Right, and so originally the app downloads were supposed to be cut off this past week, and that has been extended to September 27th, as you said, as this deal works to create a new company called TikTok Global, which Oracle and Walmart would hold a 20% stake in. This would include the setting up of a 5-person executive board, of which the CEO of Walmart would sit, and also likely the current founder and owner of TikTok would sit. So pretty interesting that Walmart's getting into the social media game. I did not expect that.
I mean, it makes sense as a way to get some younger customers into the store, I guess. Because, if you're not familiar, we have talked about TikTok before, but you've probably at least heard the name TikTok. It's a video sharing app that counts over 100 million US users. And as we said before, your kids or grandkids can tell you a lot more about it if you need some information.
Right. So I imagine in the future there'll be a lot of kids around the Walmart doing their rollback dance for the TikTok.
So while the Trump administration has said that data of those 100 million plus users can be accessed by the Chinese government, the company ByteDance has said its data centers are located entirely outside of China, and none of that data is subject to Chinese law. But as you said, we were just about to get to a point where no one was able to download TikTok a couple of days before we record this, but we're in a little bit of a waiting period because even though this deal has a blessing from President Trump, it's not completely finalized, so there's still some details to work out.
Yeah, Trump himself has said that this would only happen if the American company controlled all of TikTok in the U.S., which 20% of the stake of the company, that doesn't sound like it's quite meeting his expectations there. So who knows if this story is over. So ByteDance, or at least its Chinese and international investors, would still own about 80% of the company, even if this full sale originally goes through.
Yeah, ByteDance is also saying that Oracle would be able to review the app's source code, but they're not going to get the algorithms or technologies that actually run TikTok. And, Oracle is saying that it will host data pertaining to American users on its cloud platform as another guard against, potentially that data getting over to China somehow.
This is all pretty similar to the Huawei U.S. government interventions last year, 2019, in which we saw sort of a row between the U.S. government and the Chinese government about their influence over the 5G networks and other security equipment that is being used in federal government positions. So I think this story is just sort of a continuation of the rift growing between the U.S. and China.
Right. There's definitely suspicion there between the U.S. government and the Chinese government. As we've said, with Huawei and other Chinese companies, some have a more direct, a rather clear direct link to the Chinese government, and others maybe not as clear of a link. And so I think it is a case-by-case basis thing, and certainly there's concern that if a foreign power was to actually have a lot of data about American citizens, that wouldn't be good. But I don't know if anyone knows for sure exactly, one, if the Chinese government is getting any of this data, and two, if they really plan to do anything with it.
Right. So if you are a current TikTok user, whether this deal goes through or not, you will still be able to keep the app on your phone if you've already got it. You're grandfathered in, I guess you would say, but you will no longer get any updates or security patches, which obviously could lead to your app becoming pretty obsolete pretty fast.
Yeah, especially since we know that TikTok has already had some vulnerability issues in the past. So you've got to think that there will be more patches necessary to keep it from having additional vulnerabilities. So you'd have a very unsecured version of TikTok on your phone rather quickly the longer you can't update it. But a lot of people, just really want to make sure that they can TikTok. So there was a big jump in downloads the day that it was announced that the time was almost up for doing so. And you got to think that people will still potentially getting those downloads in now while there's still some question about its long-term viability.
Right, it's sort of like guns or toilet paper. Once everybody knows it might become scarce, you got to run to the store and grab some. So
Yeah.
Everybody got their TikTok downloaded as quick as possible when they heard they might lose access soon.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll keep following this story because there's probably going to be another update or two before it all comes down to some sort of settled state. But the TikTok world continues to turn, I guess. Thanks for listening to this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast. And thanks again to Fortinet Field CISO Jim Richberg for joining us. Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now, however you listen, to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available. And please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode. But in the meantime, we remind you to
get secure, stay secure.